Very good. So hello, everyone. I am Marci Harris, and I am CEO and co-founder of POPVOX, but most important for this conversation, I'm a former staffer, and really happy to have you all joining us today. I'm actually coming to you live from the Bay Area, where as of midnight last night, we're on shelter in place. And I know each of you is dealing with the logistics of handling, keeping yourself and your family safe, and also continuing to do the important work that you do. So we appreciate you tremendously. I want to recognize Daniel quickly because he's going to be pulling double duty today. He is running the technology of all of this, but he'll also be citing the Constitution later. So it's a pretty impressive multitasking that he'll be doing. I also want to let you know that the RSVP list for this was significant. So we have among you participants, there are staffers from leadership in House and Senate, their support offices. We have a former member, so Representative Baird, thank you for joining us with vast experience on the continuity question. We also have some guests from the European Parliament, UK Parliament. There is broad interest in this topic, so we appreciate everyone joining us from their various locations. Also, there's some political scientists and others joining, a lot of people who really want to help you as staffers do your job and get through what is a very stressful time right now. I also want to just let you know that I'll try to keep everybody to time, so there's lots of questions at the end. There were some excellent questions submitted. Some were very pertinent to the topic today, and we'll get to those. Some were broader, and they still need to be addressed. So we're keeping a list of those, and we'll have other calls in the future, potentially bringing in other experts who, hello there, other experts who can answer the questions that came up. As Daniel mentioned, you're able to ask questions with the Q&A link below. We may not get to all of them, but we'll address in future calls. And also the call is being recorded and will be shared. As many of you may have realized, this came together really quickly because John and Norm answered the call. So we are so grateful and appreciative for that flexibility, and also for Daniel being able to reach out to so many people so quickly. So with that, I will turn it over to Lorelei to introduce our speakers.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us on such quick notice. I'm Lorelei Kelly. I'm at Georgetown's Beeck Center for Social Impact and Innovation. And I just want to introduce John Fortier and Norm Ornstein, both friends and colleagues of mine who have deep and vast backgrounds in the institution of Congress. They are Congress lovers and are going to share with us today sort of the most recent deep dive into continuity of Congress, although there has been changes effected inside Congress and in the rules since 2003. They were the leads on the last significant report after September 11th, 2001, with the report that came out in 2003. So they'll refer back to that, but I think that the most important thing is that they're here today to start this conversation off. So I wanted to say thank you, John and Norm. They have tremendous authorship and scholarship to their name. So I just encourage anybody to look at a Bipartisan Policy Center. Norm has written several books, but he's affiliated with the American Enterprise Institute. So thank you both for being with us today. And you can always also find me and write to me. I'm just Lorelei.Kelly@georgetown.edu. But I want to hand it over to you ASAP so we can get into the discussion. And certainly if you're on this call and you have any particular background in continuity issues, let us know. We're going to keep this going. Thanks.
So this is Norm. Let me just start with a few introductory comments. And I'm also glad to hear that Brian Baird is on. Brian and I really got the discussion of continuity going at around the same time. As I've written in multiple places, and I try to do something every September 11th on the anniversary to try and kickstart some action. I was at Dulles Airport on 9/11 in the morning, and they called us off the jetway when the second plane hit the World Trade Center. Went back home, and it occurred to me that afternoon when United 93 crashed in Pennsylvania that that had been headed for the Capitol dome, and if it had plane had not left 45 minutes late, it probably would have reached its target around the same time as the Pentagon. We would have had mass chaos and very possibly fallen below the constitutional requirement for a quorum. And it just jolted me to realize that there was no plan in place to deal with this, and that we could be without a Congress at the worst possible time. The worst possible time could include in the immediate aftermath of a vicious terrorist attack, but obviously we're now seeing what could happen in the midst of a pandemic if somehow we did not have a Congress functioning. And Brian came to the conclusion roughly the same time as he was amidst the chaos on the Hill when members had no clue about where to go or what to do. Now, I would add just very quickly that when we had the anthrax scare, which came in the aftermath of 9/11, it raised another set of very interesting questions. The House of Representatives, of course, can be replenished through special elections, but those took 4 months or more at the time. And the idea, the Band-Aid that Speaker Hastert and his colleagues put on when they didn't want to do anything else, of saying that you'd have to have elections within 45 days if there were some kind of mass catastrophe, is completely unworkable. But what if you have a Senate where large numbers of members are incapacitated? They're still members. We had this with one, Karl Mundt, for a very long period of time, who was incapable of serving. But that would mean also you fall below a quorum, and there's a need for some temporary appointments. All of that, though, to fast forward, takes us to where we are now. At the time, back in 2002, Jim Langevin of Rhode Island added a proposal that we create some kind of capacity for a virtual Congress. That also went nowhere, but what we're seeing now is, as Speaker Pelosi has said, that members are going to soon leave for home and ask not to travel. The airlines may shut down entirely. We have got to have a way of making sure that Congress can meet. And right now, there is no way to meet outside of a face-to-face gathering, either in the Capitol or another place designated by the Speaker or the Senate Majority Leader. So that's the most urgent thing to me right now. We have larger issues to deal with. But it's not just saying, all right, we're going to pass a bill so that you can deliberate from home. The technical capacity to do this in a secured fashion, available not just to the entire Congress, but to committees and subcommittees for what might be a prolonged period of time, is something that ought to be the first order of business right now, not perhaps quite at the same level of emergency relief, but pretty damn close. John?
It sounds like that's the pass off to John.
Thank you, Norm. And Norm's work on this is, gone back a long way. We worked together over a long time on these issues. And so I second, what Norm says. I also want to, again, thank Brian Baird, who's on the call, who was the leading member in Congress to really not only identify this issue, but to push for solutions for it, even though we didn't really get those solutions at the end of the day. Key leader on this. Norm mentioned, I think, the big problem, and just quickly to reiterate, this may not be the problem that we end up facing. We hope it's that problem we don't end up facing with this crisis, is that we find it very difficult to fill vacancies, certainly from a mass amount of deaths of members of Congress. The House of Representatives essentially would be ineffective or couldn't operate at all for many months because there is no constitutional provision for appointing members or getting members in place to replace them in a mass catastrophe situation. The Senate, Norm mentioned some aspects which are related to incapacity, which might affect it, but in terms of deaths, they could reconstitute themselves relatively quickly because of gubernatorial appointments. We don't have that in the House. So I think that's a key issue. I don't think we're going to get there, but we could even get to some places that are along the line there, such as 20 members who have died, or people who are really badly incapacitated, unable to function. That doesn't keep the body from operating, but really does potentially change majorities, do things like this. So I don't think we're going to solve that problem today. We believe that solution was a constitutional amendment. We didn't want to have a constitutional amendment, but that was really the only way of getting at that core problem. but it's something I think should be in the back of everybody's mind, that we still do not have fixed the core problem if we really did have members that were not there. I guess I do want to weigh in on the current crisis in a few ways. And I think this group and Norm's piece alerting the world that we need to think about this, and Congress itself really do need to start thinking immediately about how one operates in semi-normal times where a few members or 10 members or 30 members aren't able to meet, or in a worst case scenario where they're really back all of their districts and almost no one can come back to Washington. I do think that technology can have a role, but I'm going to ask for a little caution on this, or at least to think that the first thing, or at least in parallel, is to think about how leaders and how the institutions and how the parties would deal with these issues. This is not a perfect kind of governing and not a perfect kind of Congress, but there are all sorts of informal mechanisms, from things that are sometimes still done and sometimes in one house or the other, like proxy voting or members pairing with one another, to governing that essentially done by unanimous consent on the floor by a few members of Congress. That's not the ideal. That's not what we want. But I realistically think if we move to things quickly, that's what we're going to have. We're going to have some sort of scenario where the members are in their districts and a few members of the party and leaders might be here in Washington and be able to very loosely and generally speak for those members. Hopefully, I think even with simple consultation by phone, talking with each other, to get the sense of the members, and then trying to think that flexibility, which again isn't going to allow all the same kind of voting that we do today and all the same kind of debate, and it probably is not going to allow more partisan measures to go forward. It's going to be somewhat more consensual, that we could build on that by adding back in technology and ways of interacting, having discourse, registering votes. It might be as simple as at first that the leaders are essentially representing the views of the members, and the members are sending in after the fact how they would have voted, and it's reflected in the record. If we could build that to something that was a little more interactive, to something that was a little more live, a little more secure, I'm for that. But again, I think realistically, we're going to start with the more flexible mechanisms of the Senate and the party workings. And we should think about, not wait till then, but think about now how we might make that process more robust and make it start to look more like a regular Congress using technological methods, rather than thinking we're going to build this system that's going to recreate Congress from the beginning. It's just going to work right away, because I think we're going to start from the point of informality and using the flexibility of the Senate and the House that it has today.
John, that is absolutely a perfect setup to go into what kinds of rule changes or flexibility or authorities might actually make that kind of experimentation possible. So I'm going to open it up for Daniel to discuss some of those mechanisms, and then I think probably go back to more of a kind of discussion between the three of you, and then open it up to audience questions. So with that, Daniel, over to you.
Great, thank you so much. I am pleased to be in such august company with John and Norm and Marci and Lorelei, people who are real champions in making Congress more effective. So one of my first days on the Hill was 9/11. I was having a job interview in the Senate, actually, and then I got that interview, and 5 weeks later I was the subject of the anthrax attack. And what's notable about both of those circumstances, it looks like we just lost Lorelei. What was notable about both of those circumstances is the nature of the danger was that if you go someplace else, it's fine. But the nature of the coronavirus threat is that the danger comes from being in close contact with other people. And Congress is, as we have just discussed, not ready for that, not ready for that kind of threat. But it can be. But the way to make that possible is to address that threat now. And there are a number of things that Congress can do virtually instantaneously. And in fact, I would argue that they need to do immediately to ensure the continuity of deliberation and voting on the House floor, the Senate floor, and in the committees. So many congressional rules require or contemplate in-person participation for deliberation or for voting. House committees have quorum requirements for debate and for quorum, and there are some in-person requirements for taking testimony. Senate has interesting requirements. The committees are not allowed to report out legislation unless they have a number of people present physically in person, which is a significant issue, before they can report legislation back to the full chamber. On the floor, both for committee of the whole and for approval and for debate, there's often requirements for recognition that you need to be there in person. In the Senate, if you want to offer an amendment, you need a physical piece of paper that you give to the clerks. Although the House is a little bit better at moving a lot of this stuff sort of electronically. And there are other processes that also currently require in-person participation, like recognition on the floor, like how you co-sponsor bills, signing bills as they pass each chamber to transmit them physically in a trolley over to the other chamber. There is some Supreme Court precedent on this, but not much. There is what I consider a hilariously named case called U.S. versus Ballin, from 1890 or so, that arose in the context of when there is a quorum on the House floor. And it's worth noting that these standards have changed over time. It used to be that, for example, if people didn't vote for or against, then you would be counted towards whether there's a quorum necessary to participate, and that's something that changed. So there are changes in how these processes have worked over time, including voting as well, to allow electronic voting instead of walking past the teller or roll call votes or things like that. The good news is that much can be fixed right now with fairly minor rules changes. It's possible, for example, to deem people who are remotely participating as if they were there in person. The Constitution allows the House and Senate to prescribe their own rules in that, again, funny Supreme Court case called Ballin, within the constraints of the Constitution, allows them to determine what those procedures or mechanisms might be. Some provisions may simply be able to be suspended. The Senate, as John alluded to, allows proxy voting in its committees. The House used to allow it, but doesn't allow that anymore. But of course, proxy voting requires some sort of in-person nature. There may be other ways of getting there. I think technology can address a lot of this, and this is a lot less complicated than people may necessarily think. So when we think about remote voting and remote deliberations, particularly voting, what we think about is millions of people voting in the general election, and that electronic voting in that context is not secure. In the context of committees, when you're dealing with 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 people, it's a different circumstance. And even the chambers, 100 in the Senate, 441 in the House, if you include the delegates, or 443. Like that is a number that you could, for example, accommodate in a Zoom conference. Now, one of the issues that arises is authentication. So you're seeing me right now, and you're hearing me right now. And since we've worked together, you know that this is me speaking and not a simulacra. So if Lorelei were to take a poll of John and Norm and Marci and say, let it be resolved that Daniel should get a pay raise, and we go around and John says aye, and Marci says aye, and Norm says aye, we have just conducted a vote that is remote that we can have confidence in. And if we take the recording of this and we webcast it live so that you can watch it so the press can see it, and if we put the video online, and if we do sort of the other things that hopefully Brad Fitch is fired, and if we do the other things that are necessary to allow the press and the public to participate, then we can hold votes in that way. Now, this is not ideal. This is not as good as in-person deliberation, but it is much better than no deliberation or no quorum voting whatsoever. So there are techniques to sort of address some of these problems. Now, this would be worse in the Senate.
I just want to make sure everyone gets the joke, which is that Brad Fitch opposes a pay raise for Daniel. So.
Yes. Yes. Thank you for the Congressional Management Foundation for weighing in on this vital issue. I'm sure that your opinions will be noted when it becomes relevant to do so. So my recommendations, and I put a link in the Zoom webinar to a very short memo on this point, are as follows. That because of the nature of this emergency, and the emergency is that members either will get sick or die or be unable to travel to convene in a physical location, that either the Speaker of the House or that the Majority Leader of the Senate be able to invoke remote session by fiat. They already have this power to move the chambers remotely elsewhere, so this is not an extension of the powers that they would have. That in making that invocation, the chamber would have to ratify that determination through remote deliberation, through remote conversation, and that it would be time limited for 30 days and then need to be renewed. This would address the concerns that some people have expressed that the chambers are not ready to move for full remote deliberation, and I think that there's real concerns about whether that should be a thing. But this allows us to address the circumstances now so that the House and the Senate can consider legislation as necessary. There will be technological questions. They don't need to be addressed in the resolutions. Where they can be addressed is that you can delegate responsibility to the House Administration Committee to promulgate regulations regarding the technology, and the same for the Senate Rules Committee, which is something that they regularly and commonly do. So you can trigger the emergency, you can have the chambers vote to allow this to happen. You can make it so that electronic deliberation is deemed to be the equivalent for in-person deliberation for the duration of the emergency. And that will largely get us where we need to go. And if there are other changes that need to be made, we will now have sufficient resources and capabilities for the House and the Senate to change the rules. The one fatal flaw is that you have to do this now while you're in person. For the Senate to make a UC vote, for example, they do a roll call, they do a quorum call first. And if you're not there, it doesn't work. The House is a little bit better where they do allow unanimous consent. There's sort of ways to get there that's a little bit more flexible. But they really need to be making these determinations now before a lot of members become sick or die or otherwise can't travel. So I think, oh good, I've actually hit my time. So like that's just about right. There's a lot more to talk about here. Like I think John's ideas about proxy voting and pairing are interesting. Oh, let me just flag one more thing very quickly. 3 countries in the Commonwealth currently allow proxy voting. The United Kingdom, Australia, and New Zealand allow it. Their systems are sufficiently different from ours that they allow their whips to basically do the voting for them. And this proxy voting was designed in the context of like nursing mothers or other folks who are unable to physically be present, but there is some precedent there. And Rhode Island and Utah are currently looking at legislation right now on the state level to allow remote deliberations as well. So this is something that is moving apace in other places. And remote deliberations is well made for the way that Robert's Rules of Order or the Jefferson's Manual sort of operates. This is not ideal, but I think that this is something that is technically doable. So with that, thank you. I'm happy to turn it back over to Marci.
Well, that's fantastic. Everybody's staying on time, which is fantastic. So I just want to clarify, Daniel, that what you're saying is rather than suggesting a large change to the rules themselves, what you're suggesting is temporary authority to change the definition of present.
Yes.
And that has constitutional precedence.
Yeah, yes. So in the House, for example, there is a recent change to the House rules that permits electronic documents to be considered to be the equivalent of paper documents in a number of circumstances. Where there's a sort of universal change that back applies to everything else, that has allowed, for example, notice of an amendment on the floor is now done electronically and isn't done by paper in the way that it used to be. I think similarly, for the purposes of an emergency, we can deem people to be present if the way that they are participating is sufficiently like how they would be participating otherwise if they were there in person. I think that is a way to get us where we need to go. Yeah, so I think that answers your question.
Great. So I would like to throw it back to John and Norm to maybe riff on anything that brought up. We have a couple of questions that have come in various formats, which I will bring back to you, but just to give the 3 of you an opportunity to discuss a bit.
So this is Norm. I would just say the only concern that I would have, I think Daniel's ideas are terrific for something that can be done now, because the fact is they're not going to sit down and go through any lengthy deliberations over creating a brand new infrastructure. When I mentioned secure, I wasn't thinking so much in the context of a larger election. I want to be sure that you have deliberations that can't be easily mucked up by Russians or others, knowing that they could get in and create some real problems, maybe bring down a network when Congress really needed to make decisions. That's my concern about security. Whether typical Zoom meetings are going to be sufficient, I'm just not sure. I have my doubts.
Yeah, and I guess first I'd like to say that, look, Norm, you look like you're making a TikTok video there, so I appreciate that. And I agree with a lot of where Daniel is going. I guess I do think that, for example, in terms of being able to call back the House, if we think about the worst case where really nobody can come back, we are thinking about that. I think we're probably, even in a very bad situation, we are likely thinking about a situation where most members can't come back, but there is some group that is here on the floor. And so while I don't think it's crazy to think about these questions about deeming people present or not, we should think about that. But I think we're going to get around that by having some leadership representation or some rump group on the floor being able to speak for the members broadly. But the challenge is to then have ways of the members communicating their preferences. And again, I think early on is probably going to be really informal, or just, the leaders taking the temperature of their caucuses and deals being cut behind the scenes. But we could build more on top of that. And I think that especially committees are different, they're important. And you do have the possibility of proxy voting, at least in the Senate, where there are things that could go on, and I think a Zoom conference actually might work well in a committee. It's more difficult on the Senate floor, where I think essentially things are probably going to be done by unanimous consent or by small groups that are reflecting back their members, and the technology should facilitate that. Security, Norm's absolutely right. If we got to a system that was robust and was actual kind of more like roll call voting far away, we'd want that to be secure. We might even consider making sure that we have secure communication between members. I don't know that we need to make it, well, I don't know what level of security we need, but there's going to be a lot of informal communication, right? It's not all going to be the public communication. We're going to have members just communicating with each other in groups and individually. And to the extent security is needed for some things, I think that's something we don't necessarily always extend to members of Congress. We think about the executive branch. And that might be something that we, can allow that communication to go on.
Can I get in on that for a sec? So I think, John, your point is right. I think that is an evergreen point. It's this circumstance, it makes it particularly concerning, but members being able to communicate with other members in secure ways is always a concern. Some members still have AOL email addresses where they chat with other folks, right? There are some things that they can do now that are more secure, where all members could get on Signal to talk to their staff and to other members, and that would be, sort of an interim step. So I would break this into a couple of tranches, maybe. There are the things like sort of the routine communications. There's changes in sort of IT-wide infrastructure that needs to be done. So the House is now on Office 360 online. The Senate isn't necessarily, although I could be confused. So there's a lack of investment in technology in the legislative branch that's gone back at least 20 to 30 years, where they invest money elsewhere and not in the House and the Senate. And that is a big problem with why the technology is not particularly good and doesn't support a lot of the remote proceedings and deliberations and office work that needs to happen regardless. And I think that is exactly the right point. In the context of the coronavirus, I think that those things need to be addressed in the near term, and they need to be putting money from the supplemental and other things towards fixing technology in the House so that it functions appropriately to do this type of conversation and deliberation. But I would suggest that the first order of business is making sure that the chambers, I think, can continue, and I'm not suggesting you're suggesting otherwise, but that the chambers can continue to operate through voting. And there will be things that they won't be able to do, right? There's going to be a lot of reviewing of classified matters is going to be something that's going to be difficult. You have to go to your local SCIF. There's a lot of other things that don't work for this if this lasts for more than a month or two. But I'm concerned about the next month or 2 or 3, and then they can always go and change things to, if this is something that would persist for a year, they can then look at remote facilities in the districts or more money, the other stuff that needs to come that is beyond the scope of our chat, I think, a little bit today, but are totally right in terms of how you have conversations that are protected and secure and so on and so forth.
I guess just one thing, and I don't know we have huge disagreement. A very early step and prior to technology, although I think wanting to develop that in a parallel way, is just leaders communicating and having a plan to communicate with their members and to talk across the aisle about the types of, let's call it, shortcuts that they may be taking in a situation where people are remote. Most people are remote, but there are a few people speaking for them. I mean, and the chambers have different rules and the committees have different rules. Some of them may need to be changed, but even just some basic agreement and understanding, laying out of principles that say, look, we may need to move to a situation where essentially, Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer are the only ones on the Senate floor, and there are only a few people on the House floor, and we are going to have to take some actions by which we want to survey you, get your opinion, act in certain ways. I mean, that's not an obvious thing for people, and then is there a way to boost the technology, boost the transparency for this, have people weigh in a little more directly? That can be built around that. But I think thinking about just the ways in which the Senate House are going to have to operate much more on unanimous consent, or much more with small groups of members present in other places, and then thinking about how the technology might supplement that is a better way of thinking than let's create the House and the Senate virtually and have that in place to go forward.
Yeah,
Well,
I
think,
just have one more thing to that?
Yeah.
I would just say that you're right, and part of this is we should encourage House Admin and Senate rules to put forward recommendations on how to have the secure conversations using technology that's currently available, and look forward to what should be happening next. So,
well, and just a quick question there. This has come up from a few different places, asking about the timing. So timing in two different ways. I think from the standpoint of what actions do you think need to be taken now in order, whether it's the kind of rules changes or even cultural changes that you're talking about, John, and that have to be taken in the very short term. What are the things that have to be thought about in the very short term? And how you're thinking about this change if we're talking about 6 weeks, 6 months, or 18 months? So just throwing that out for everyone.
who do you want first?
John.
Okay. So, I guess I think that the one thing is I think the House and Senate probably should not go out. They should remain in pro forma session. I think they should have people here, and I appreciate the idea of trying to figure out ways to call Congress back if there were nobody here, but let's not go out fully and have the opportunity to do something with Congress if needed, if there are only a few people here. Second, I mentioned earlier, look, I just think there are, I guess let's start with floor voting. Not the committees aren't important, but we should think about how leaders are going to get feedback from their members if they're not here, and lay out ways in which they will be acting in shortcut ways of by unanimous consent and other methods, knowing that the members aren't going to be there, knowing that it's not a usual situation. But I think just getting buy-in on that is extremely important. The committee process, look, I think if you were to think about rules changes, I do think there probably are some things one should think about, and maybe this is the time in the House to bring back proxy voting. Pairing is probably it's more of an informal thing. For maybe good reason, it was taken away years ago, but I think people would understand, at least in a temporary way, that would be a useful thing. And I do think that I guess I think the committees probably could recreate a committee-like situation without having a top-down, one-size-fits-all system. I mean, really, they probably could go to Zoom meetings, at least for discussion hearings, whatever you'd like to call them, whether the votes actually occur that way or whether somebody present surveys the members and sees the votes and then records it in a certain way, either by proxy or something. I think that's worth thinking about. I do think the secure communication, I know that can be very difficult, and maybe it really is to just begin with members knowing and being able to get to SCIFs in their districts and be able to communicate that way is the start of this. But I think, again, thinking about ways that members can communicate. It's not as easy as making sure everybody has everybody's cell phone number, but I mean, in some ways that's part of it, or there are other, or other ways. And I think just, the experience after 9/11, when the members of Congress and staff all got BlackBerries, well, that was because they really couldn't communicate on 9/11, and there's a little bit better communication now, but it's really thinking about just having to communicate with lots of your members and having an effective way to do that is also important. Finally, look, I know some of you are former staffers. My wife's a Senate staffer, and the staff are going to be here in DC. They may not be in the chamber or in the offices, but that's something also to think about, that those staff are going to need to talk to each other. And again, it's somewhat informal, and it's not going to be live online, but I do think making sure that we have very effective ways to keep that communication going is useful.
And I want to highlight that's a very good point, both that staff and members need to be able to communicate with each other. We have a comment in the question channel basically asking for these kinds of procedures to be laid out. And I've heard this from several people and I know leadership in both the House and Senate are trying to figure out what it would be that would be laid out, the processes that would be possible. And that's still evolving. But I think the idea that direction about how committees can continue to operate or how staffers should be conducting themselves, that having directives on that is helpful. I know we have some staffers from Rules and House Admin and other places on the call, or at least that RSVP'd, who are working through that now within their own universes. This is really just the beginning of a conversation and kind of the hope to bring together the expertise from outside, inside, and start the conversation. Norm, do you have any comments on what was just said?
What I would say a couple of things. One is there is some significant expertise inside the government about these kinds of meetings, including at the FCC. And it would be very wise for Congress to try and tap into that. At the same time, Cisco in particular has created all of these ways of doing secure remote meetings that the private sector uses all the time, especially now with international businesses. And I don't think it's a bad idea to try and get one or more of those companies to step up. Obviously, we don't want to use Google because they're throwing everything into accommodating the president's demands right now. But there are a lot of other companies that could help out as well. And that can solve a lot of the problems, at least in terms of making sure it's secure. And I would say, again, I would worry very much about outside malign forces, or maybe even some inside, that would do whatever they could to disrupt or tilt this process. And to get back to John's point, I'd be perfectly happy if we had a Congress where everybody was away, but basically it was run by the representatives from Virginia and Maryland. If Chris Van Hollen, Ben Cardin, and Mark Warner were making a lot of these decisions, that'd be fine. A lot of other people wouldn't be so happy with that. And I'm not so sure I want to have a unanimous consent where Louis Gohmert is still around and present. We've got to find other ways of making sure that this is robust and representative. And that was my real unhappiness with David Dreyer and Denny Hastert and others who said, we've got to have elections, we've got to have elections. but went to a process that if there were some kind of huge disaster, the elections would be anything but representative of public viewpoints. So that has to be foremost in our minds and making sure that nobody can disrupt this.
Well, and Norm, I just want to point out that one of the reasons that Congress needs to be able to continue to function is that there may be questions that come up with how elections are carried out if we are still under these kinds of shelter-in-place orders as we get into later in the election season. So the ability to act, and that's where proxy voting might not actually be as acceptable to many if you're making very consequential.
And I would note
that
we're seeing today, we've had a lot of focus, many of us, including some on the call, on what could happen if there were a disruption in the election in the fall. And what we've seen just in the last day or two with how Florida, for example, and Ohio are reacting to this crisis. Imagine a nightmare if we don't have a national process in place, if individual governors or state legislatures are making decisions, some of which might be made so that they could put a thumb on the scales of the election, or that would create a process where the election results are just simply not acceptable or representative. We need to have a Congress that can step in under those circumstances and try and make sure that we have an election that is full and fair.
Well, and you're coming back, Norm, to a point that was just made by Brian Baird, which is the importance of Congress maintaining its ability to conduct oversight and serve as a check and balance. Yes. And I know that is something that has come up, John and Norm, in your work over the years.
No question. And when we had 9/11, the idea that for months, many months, we might have had a president unilaterally making all kinds of decisions under what would have been the equivalent of martial law, or as Marco Rubio says, marital law. In his tweets, was not something that's acceptable, and it's not acceptable now either. Congress is the backbone of this system, and at times of emergency, it's even more important that we have that representative body.
Well, and I would just note that there are many members now talking about this, and I think working on various ways that the continuity could take place in this situation. And certainly it is a bipartisan discussion that is beginning to emerge. Daniel, have you got thoughts on the question of what needs to happen and timeframes?
So in the next week, this week, before the Senate goes out, which they won't do, but they should, the concept of present, I think, needs to be changed. We need to make the option available if they are not able to reconvene in person, that they can that you can treat remote voting, remote participation as present. There are many provisions in the House and Senate rules, for example, on the Senate side, to have a vote on the Senate floor by unanimous consent, first thing you have is a quorum call. Well, you can't have a quorum call if no one's, you can't, there's ways around, but it's like people aren't there, so you can't get to the right number, which puts the determinations in jeopardy later on, should a court review determinations that are made by the House or Senate to pass legislation to criminalize behavior, to do other things. So the first thing I think that needs to be done is that the concept of present in the committees and in both chambers needs to be able to be expanded to allow in person to mean, or allow present to mean present electronically through whatever means that is able to be determined by the Senate Rules Committee and the Committee on House Administration as is appropriate. Because all these other questions, I think, Congress can grapple with and debate and resolve, but if they're unable to operate in formal session and the formal processes by which they do things on the floors and to a lesser extent, but still important extent in their committees, then the rest of this, these changes like they can happen later, but they can't happen without this happening. This is the keystone. And the other thing that I would say is that there was a lot of discussion about remote secure deliberations in meetings. I think there is great value in that. A lot of the work is done behind closed doors. But for the open door proceedings where the actual legislation is moved through the process 95% of the time, the hearings and markups in the committees, the markups, deliberations, and votes on the floors, those are done in public. You can go and see them. They are required by the rules to be publicly available, except in limited circumstances. And we need to make sure that one, those can happen, which means that we count people participating electronically as being there. They need to be open to the press, so we should be able to watch what happens and verify what happens, and the public should be able to at least see what's happening as well, both because that is the nature of a representative deliberative democracy, and because it gives credit and credence to the work that is happening in those bodies, so people can understand what's happening, that Congress is acting to go and address the issues that that are affecting them right now. One final thing, and I don't have enough knowledge to get into this, but Brian Baird had mentioned, members either dying, which in some ways is actually easier to deal with than if they're incapacitated. There's special rules on the House side to deal with lowering the threshold for a quorum that may or may not be constitutional. I don't have enough background to know what the nature of that is. That will be something that needs to be dealt with as well by the House and by the Senate. But the first thing that they need to do before those things happen, while there's still enough people that are healthy and able to participate, if not in person, is to address the in-person requirements, the presence requirements. That is the keystone to allow all these other conversations to have the time they need to be well ventilated so that we can make a determination as to what the next step should be.
John and Norm, would you be able to speak to that question of changing rules on quorum and succession and how you've looked at that in the past?
Sure. This was a key issue for us. I mean, I think constitutionally, people, there's some historical precedent disagreement with this, but I think constitutionally it's pretty clear that a majority of the House and a majority of the Senate, that is a quorum. For a variety of reasons, we've defined that down a little bit, sometimes talking about members who are sworn and elected, but the solution, and I put that in quotes, of people who are trying to deal with the continuity problem after 9/11 was to not deal with this issue of really getting replacement people into the House quickly, but thinking that they can go forward with a really small group of people in the House. So there is something in the House rules contemplates lots of people being dead or incapacitated, where by a call of the chair, people not showing up, you kind of define down the full number of people in the House to arguably could be a very small number. You could say 20 is the number, and then you need a majority of that. We were very opposed to that. The reason being, I think that in a case where people really aren't alive or they're not able to speak for themselves, having a House of Representatives go forward with 20 members, 50 members, 100 members, and members that could be wildly different in the political orientation than they were before the accident happened or before the attack happened, or from one state or from one region, that would be very distorting. So there's a temptation to think about defining down the rule, the quorum, but we actually thought it was problematic. Now, in this case, we are contemplating, well, if we don't have the worst, we're contemplating that many people are actually functioning. They're just not able to come together, not able to come to Washington. And, I don't think we need to play with the quorum for that reason. Again, I go back to I think we are likely to deal with this situation with some people being able to show up here in Washington. I know there are problems with that, and I know it doesn't look quite normal, and trying to then have the others who are out there reflect their preferences back to those leaders of both parties, maybe hopefully as transparently as possible, and maybe at some point looking more like voting, in which case, the rules for the quorum, they're essentially nobody's going to suggest the absence of a quorum. If you think we're going to have a situation where a troublemaker is hanging around and is always going to be objecting to the quorum, I mean, that is a very difficult situation. And I guess, I don't have a perfect answer for that. But again, I think realistically, the way we are going to deal with this situation is somehow reflecting back the preferences of the members to a smaller group here in Washington. And, first steps for me, I'm less worried about the presence and question and voting in that sense, as much as I'm worried that, or think that leaders need to go and have a process in mind that their members are comfortable with, and that ultimately can begin to become more transparent, and maybe very transparent at some point. It might be as simple as, surveying the members and publishing the results of how they would have voted, but the technical floor votes are done by a smaller group that speaks for them. I think that's more likely where we will end up if we have that bad situation. So that's, and that relates to the quorum question as well.
So I would just add a couple of things. I mean, one is the Constitution is pretty clear that a quorum is half the members. Since the Civil War, they've defined it as half of those who are present and living. And there we get into this situation, which we contemplated after 9/11. What happens if there's an event at an inauguration and everybody's taken out except the California delegation wasn't there, or the Texas delegation? Is that really what you want, representing a Congress and acting in this fashion? But I think there's another real question now. If this turns into the absolute nightmare that it probably won't but could, and especially where those who are over 65 are the most vulnerable, you could have a Senate where 50 or 60 were on ventilators and incapacitated, and there is no provision to deal with that. It's why we wanted to have temporary members who would then be relieved of their responsibilities once people were able to get back and be healthy again. That would require, I think, a constitutional amendment, which we're not going to be doing right now, but we have to at least get into the mix thinking about what happens if not just people are away from Washington and can't convene face to face, but are really unable to participate at all. And there's no easy answer to that, but we need at least some discussion of it.
That is very sobering, Norm. We just had a comment come through from Brian Baird that I would like to read. He says, in some ways, this may stimulate a responsible solution to other types of crises. For example, a credible nuclear or biochemical threat to eliminate the capital city, or a far more lethal outbreak. The point is, we may in the future need a remote meeting possibility and solutions to issues of the quorum, remote voting, etc. If we use this opportunity to recognize and address the need for a real solution, this will in some very painful ways be a beneficial stimulus for people who otherwise would refuse to act and prepare. So I think that is an excellent point. There, as you mentioned, that we saw this the impetus for adoption of Blackberries and emails come following anthrax and 9/11. I want to let the participants know we've got about 6 or 7 more minutes, and so if there are other questions from the audience that you'd like to pose, please jump into the Q&A. And Daniel, I know there were some questions submitted before we started. If there's anything there that you would like to answer, please do.
Yeah, so the questions that were submitted largely had to do with like implementation. So if people still have questions about different ways that one could implement remote participation, happy to chat about that. I would suggest that, and we all talked about this a little bit before, but part of the reason that Congress is having problems with its technology, whether it's having to do with security or with deliberations or otherwise, is an underinvestment in the legislative branch. So as there is determination discussion around a third supplemental, considering that the nature of staff having to telework, the old computers that are available, the need for different technologies that you can't co-sponsor, like all these different things, put some money towards paying for the clerk of the House and the sergeant at arms in the Senate and some others to finish development of things such as, like, the House literally just passed HRES 657 that had 29 recommendations to modernize the House, many of which would be relevant to this circumstance. You know, this is not a lot of money that would be required to do this, but a little bit of money would help address a number of the sticking points, whether it's how members have secure communications with each other, how people telework. And we should also just remember, and we didn't talk about this before, this isn't just personal, committee, and leadership staff. Clerk's Office, the Sergeant at Arms, Secretary of the Senate, the Library of Congress, the Congressional Research Service, the GAO, the CBO, the GPO. These are all folks, tens of thousands of people who provide support to Congress, and they need to be able to work in a safe environment. They need to be able to collaborate. There are provisions in the House and Senate rules that say that things aren't, House Rules Committee changes are not official until published in the Congressional Record. And if we can't publish the Congressional Record, does that mean that those changes would not take effect? So there are a lot of follow-on effects that are relevant to the support offices and agencies, in addition to just basic things like making sure that people have the health care that they need, that they have the support that they need, and all those other types of things. So as we're thinking about how to deal with the rest of the country, we also need to make sure that we support the support office and agency staff to do the things they need to do.
Absolutely. And I would just say that in many ways, that was the impetus for this conversation. I think many former staffers and those who care about the institution wanting to speak for the staffers and for prioritizing the health and safety of staffers and members as we think about the bigger questions of addressing the larger crisis. And sometimes it's very difficult for Congress to speak for itself in that way. John and Norm, I'd like to give you each a minute to share any closing thoughts, and then we'll wrap.
I would just say this, I'm not sure how much longer Congress will be around. I think they're going to try and wrap up these various stimulus packages, and Speaker Pelosi has already said she'd like to see members go back home and cocoon in themselves. It is really urgent that some of these things that can be done now, and some of the simple rules changes that Daniel has mentioned, be on the docket now. We have to have people who can get to the leaders to make it clear that this is very important for them to do before they get away. There's a lot of talk of shutting down the airlines entirely. And if that happens and members can't get back in an emergency situation and they haven't acted in a fashion that gives them an opportunity to do this, we may see ad hoc actions taken that are really not legitimate or legal. So those things, along with the changes that Daniel said about the support staff and putting some money into these bills that are going through right now, we're going to be over $1 trillion. Adding a little bit to make sure we have a functioning Congress shouldn't be a heavy lift, but it has to be somebody putting that into the bills.
So I guess I would reiterate what other people have said. Just, I know we don't think this is the problem today as much as it was after 9/11, but these issues that we had talked about years ago, and Brian Baird and Norm led, of mass vacancies, mass incapacitations, are still really important, and the worst of the worst could still happen. So that's not going to get changed today, but if we forget about them, we're going to lose another opportunity to deal with them. Second, I do think that we should be doing all sorts of things logistically, providing money for all sorts of things for communication. But again, I've been advocating, and I guess I'll put it this way, maybe a slightly different way than I put it before. I would like to get to a system where Congress can vote remotely, or there's a way of doing things that looks like Congress from remote places. But again, I think we're going to begin with leadership or some groups of people being here and others reflecting back their preferences. And so if you want to think of this as an improved cloakroom or a hotline process where the parties are communicating with their members and understanding where they are and doing and moving that system ultimately to perhaps reflecting that more publicly, more transparently, I think that's where we're going to begin. If we end up being in this situation where we're there for a while and we want to begin to create more of a Congress that looks like ours, I think that's going to take time, and I think we're going to transition there. So leaders being very clear about how they communicate with their members, how they might communicate on votes, how they're reflected back, how you have an improved kind of super cloakroom or hotline type process, I think is something we should do right away.
Thank you all so much. Lorelei, thank you for bringing John and Norm together. Norm and John, thank you for agreeing to do this. Daniel, thank you for kicking it off, managing it, doing the research, and sharing your insights. I think all too often Congressional staffers don't hear the thank you for their service that sometimes gets shared with so many others who serve the American people. So today, to all of you, thank you. Please be safe and take care of yourselves. And thank you for the work that you're doing. This won't be the last call. There's